So, you want to own a supermarket chain. On paper, it sounds like one of the safest businesses a person could ever build. People need to eat. They need to eat every single day, in every economy, in every season, recession or boom. You're not selling a luxury. You're not selling something people can put off buying. You're selling survival, stacked on shelves, sold at a markup. Walk into one of your stores on a Saturday afternoon, and the evidence is everywhere. Packed parking lots, register lines stretching past the gum and the tabloids, carts overflowing with $100, $200, $300 of groceries per trip. Multiply that by 50,000 customers a week, times 52 weeks a year, times a few hundred locations, and the number in your head starts looking less like a business and more like a money printer bolted to a building. That's the fantasy. Endless foot traffic. Guaranteed demand. A product nobody can boycott because nobody can stop eating. Here's the disruption. Supermarket chains are, on average, one of the least profitable business models in modern retail. Not the least profitable in absolute dollars. Some of these companies pull in tens of billions in annual revenue. But when you strip that revenue down to what the owner actually keeps, the number gets almost embarrassingly small. Industry-wide, the average grocery retailer keeps somewhere between 1 and 3 cents of profit for every dollar that passes through the register. The pre-tax profit margin across the industry sits around 2.2%, and after taxes, it drops to roughly 1.6%. Think about that for a second. A business can generate $40 million in annual sales at a single location and still hand its owner less profit than a small, unglamorous car wash chain a fraction of its size. So why do people still fight to own these things? Why do billionaires, private equity firms, and multi-generational family dynasties keep buying, building, and defending supermarket empires, sometimes to the point of hostile takeovers and multi-billion-dollar mergers, over a business that keeps almost nothing it earns? That question is what this video is actually about, not how does a grocery store work. Everyone already half knows that. This is about the hidden mechanics underneath, the real estate games, the debt structures, the razor-thin margins that can flip negative overnight, and the strange truth that owning a supermarket chain is less about selling food and more about controlling scale, real estate, and cash flow at a level almost no other retail business can match. By the end of this, you'll understand why some operators turn supermarkets into multi-generational fortunes, why others go bankrupt running the exact same playbook, and why this boring business might actually be one of the most structurally fragile empires in modern commerce. Ask most people what a supermarket chain actually does, and you'll get some version of the same answer. It buys food cheap and sells it for more. That's not wrong. It's just almost irrelevant to how the money actually works. In the public imagination, a grocery chain is basically a giant vending machine. Trucks arrive, shelves get stocked, customers fill carts, registers ring, profit accumulates. The bigger the store, the bigger the profit. Simple multiplication. People assume the owner's biggest challenge is logistics. Keeping shelves full, keeping produce fresh, keeping lines moving. And to be fair, logistics is brutally hard here. A mid-sized supermarket can carry somewhere between 20 and 40,000 individual products, each with its own supplier, shelf life, storage temperature, and demand curve. Coordinating that is a genuine feat of operational engineering. But logistics isn't what determines whether the chain survives. It's not even close to the biggest lever. The real story is somewhere else entirely, in a set of financial mechanics most shoppers never think about, because they're not designed to be visible from the checkout line. Here's a sharper way to see it. A supermarket doesn't primarily sell groceries. It sells foot traffic, and it rents that traffic out to other businesses. Every time you walk down an aisle, you are being sold to multiple times by multiple parties, most of whom you'd never notice. The cereal brand that got the eye-level shelf paid for that placement. The soda company that owns the end cap display at the front of the store paid for that too. That featured recipe card next to the pasta sauce is often part of a paid promotional agreement. This entire hidden economy is called slotting and promotional revenue, And in a large chain, it can be worth hundreds of millions of dollars a year, money the store makes before a single item is scanned at the register. Then there's the second engine, one that's grown far more important over the last 2 decades: private label products. The chain's own store brand cereal, its own brand of paper towels, its own frozen pizza. These products often carry margins 2 to 3 times higher than the equivalent name brand item. Private label products across categories can command margins in the 50 to 60% range, compared to 20 to 30% for national brands, and in the most successful chains, store brands now make up a fifth to a quarter of everything sold. So the supermarket isn't just a food seller. It's a landlord to consumer brands, a manufacturer wearing a retailer's disguise, and increasingly, a data company. Every loyalty card swipe, every app scan, every digital coupon feeds a purchasing behavior dataset that chains now sell, license, or use to negotiate better terms with suppliers. The groceries on the shelf are almost the least interesting part of the business model. They're the bait. The real profit lives in the systems built around them. So let's say you're not buying an existing chain. You want to build one from scratch, or at least open a single flagship location to prove the concept. The number people imagine is wrong by an order of magnitude. This isn't a business you start with a small business loan and a dream. A single full-size supermarket, the kind with produce, meat, deli, bakery, and 30,000 plus SKUs, typically requires somewhere in the range of $2 to $10 million just to open the doors, depending on size, location, and whether you're building new or converting an existing space. That figure covers the building or lease build-out, refrigeration and freezer systems, which alone can run into the high 6 figures, point-of-sale infrastructure, initial inventory, and the licensing and permitting maze that comes with selling perishable food, and in many regions, alcohol. Refrigeration deserves its own call-out because it's one of the most underestimated costs in the entire business. A supermarket isn't just a building with shelves, it's an industrial cooling operation disguised as a retail store. Walk-in coolers, open-air dairy cases, frozen food islands, backroom freezers for meat storage, all of it running continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because a few hours of downtime doesn't just cost money, it destroys inventory. One failed compressor on a July afternoon can wipe out tens of thousands of dollars in perishable stock before anyone notices. Now scale that to a chain. 20 stores, 50 stores, 200 stores. You're not just multiplying the build cost, you're adding an entirely new layer of expense. Distribution centers, refrigerated trucking fleets, regional warehousing, and enough centralized buying power to negotiate favorable terms with suppliers. That infrastructure alone can cost hundreds of millions of dollars before you've sold a single loaf of bread through it. This is why supermarket chains are almost never built purely from founder capital. They're built on debt, private equity backing, or decades of reinvested profit from an earlier, smaller version of the same business. The entry cost isn't really the barrier. The barrier is the scale required to make the economics work at all, which we'll get to next. Here's where the business starts to feel almost absurd once you understand it. A supermarket chain can post $20, $30, $40 billion in annual revenue, genuinely massive numbers, comparable to some national economies, and still keep less than 2 cents of every dollar's profit. Cost of goods sold alone typically consumes 70 to 75% of revenue before a single employee is paid, before a single light bill arrives, before a single truck is fueled. Grocery stores typically operate on gross margins between 20 and 25%, meaning for every dollar in sales, you start with maybe 22 cents of gross profit before any operating costs. Compare that to almost any other consumer business. A software company might run gross margins above 70%. A restaurant might sit around 65%. A supermarket starts the race already a lap behind, before rent, labor, spoilage, or shrinkage take their cut. So how does anyone make money here at all? Volume and margin stacking across categories. Not every product in the store carries the same margin, and understanding that spread is the actual skill of running a profitable chain. Center aisle packaged goods, canned soup, cereal, pasta often run on the thinnest margins in the store, sometimes barely above cost, because they're the easiest products for customers to price compare against a competitor down the street. But perishables, the produce, meat, and bakery sections, can generate gross margins in the 30 to 50% range because freshness and presentation are harder to comparison shop. The prepared foods counter, the in-store bakery, the deli, these are often the most profitable square footage in the entire building. This is why walking into a well-run supermarket feels like walking through a carefully engineered path. The bread is at the back, forcing you past everything else. The bakery smell hits you the moment you walk in, not by accident, but because it triggers hunger and impulse buying. High-margin perishables are placed at eye level and along the store's outer ring, while the lower-margin staples sit deeper in the aisles, because by the time you reach them, your cart is already full of the products that actually make the store money. Add slotting fees, private label margins, and loyalty-driven data revenue on top of that layered pricing structure, and you start to see how a business with a razor-thin headline margin can still generate real profit, but only if every single one of those systems is executed with precision at scale, continuously, without major error. That last part is the catch. There's almost no margin for error. If revenue is a careful balancing act, the cost side of a supermarket chain is where that balance gets tested every single day. Labor is the largest controllable expense, and it's a uniquely difficult one to manage in this industry. Grocery retailers employ an enormous, largely part-time workforce: cashiers, stockers, department managers, overnight receiving crews, and scheduling that workforce against unpredictable, hour-by-hour customer traffic is its own logistics problem. Overstaff and labor costs eat your thin margin alive. Understaff and empty shelves or long checkout lines drive customers straight to a competitor. Then there's shrinkage, the industry's polite term for inventory that simply disappears. The average shrinkage rate for grocery stores typically ranges from about 2 to 3% of total sales, coming from theft, spoilage, administrative errors, and supplier discrepancies. In perishable-heavy departments like produce and meat, that number can climb dramatically higher, with reported shrinkage rates as high as 8% in some cases. On a chain doing tens of billions in annual sales, even a single percentage point of shrinkage represents hundreds of millions of dollars evaporating before it ever reaches the bottom line. Real estate is the next silent killer, and it works in two directions at once. Supermarkets need enormous footprints, typically 40 to 60,000 square feet or more, in locations with heavy population density and easy access, which means expensive land or expensive leases almost by definition. But supermarkets are also unusually valuable to landlords because they function as anchor tenants that draw consistent foot traffic to an entire shopping center, which smaller retailers depend on to survive. That gives supermarket chains real negotiating leverage over rent, but it also means the chain becomes structurally entangled with the health of the real estate around it. If the surrounding retail dies, the anchor tenant often gets dragged into renegotiations, vacancies next door, and declining center-wide traffic. Then there's refrigeration and utilities, running continuously regardless of sales volume. Regulatory compliance around food safety, health inspections, and, in many regions, alcohol and pharmacy licensing. Supply chain and distribution costs, which spike unpredictably with fuel prices, trucking shortages, and geopolitical disruptions to the global food supply. And finally, debt service, because very few chains are built or expanded without financing, and every store opening, refrigeration upgrade, or acquisition typically means taking on more leverage against a business that already keeps almost nothing in profit. Stack all of that against a gross margin in the low to mid-20s, and you start to understand something uncomfortable about this business. Labor, cost of goods, shrinkage, and occupancy together typically consume over 95% of total revenue. The entire operating discipline of a supermarket chain exists inside that remaining sliver. This is where weaker operators quietly break, often without anyone outside the company noticing until it's too late. The first trap is scale without discipline. Opening new stores feels like growth, and growth feels like success. But every new location is a new lease, a new refrigeration system, a new staff to train, a new set of local competitors to fight. If even a handful of those new stores underperform, the debt taken on to build them doesn't underperform along with them. It stays fixed, while the revenue backing it wobbles. Expansion in this business isn't just an opportunity. It's a bet, repeated store by store, and every bet compounds the chain's fragility if even a few of them go wrong. The second trap is price war exposure. Because groceries are one of the most price comparison shopped categories on earth, customers know almost exactly what a gallon of milk or a dozen eggs should cost. Chains have almost no room to raise prices without losing customers to a competitor a few miles away. That means when input costs rise, fuel, wholesale food prices, minimum wage increases, a chain often can't simply pass the full cost onto customers. It has to absorb some of it, directly cutting into a margin that was already razor thin to begin with. The third trap is the one people underestimate most: single points of operational failure. A supermarket's entire business model depends on an unbroken cold chain, a functioning point-of-sale network, and a continuous supply of fresh inventory. A regional distribution center fire, a prolonged trucking strike, a multi-day refrigeration failure across several stores. Any one of these can turn a profitable month into a loss, making one almost overnight, because there's no cushion built into a 2% margin to absorb a shock. And the fourth trap is consolidation pressure. As larger chains grow, they gain purchasing power that lets them negotiate lower supplier costs than smaller regional operators can ever match. That creates a slow-motion squeeze. Mid-sized chains get caught between giant national players who can outprice them and hyper-local independents who can out-relationship them. Historically, this is exactly the pressure that has pushed mid-sized regional chains either toward being acquired or toward bankruptcy. There's rarely a comfortable, stable middle position in this industry over the long run. You don't have to look far to find this playing out in the real world. Consider the pattern that's repeated across the American grocery landscape for decades. A fast-growing regional chain expands aggressively during a strong economic run, taking on debt to open dozens of new locations. Then a downturn hits, or a larger competitor enters the market with deeper pockets and lower prices, and the chain that looked unstoppable 2 years earlier suddenly can't service its debt on razor-thin margins. Multiple well-known American grocery brands, some operating hundreds of stores and employing tens of thousands of people, have gone through exactly this cycle: rapid growth, heavy leverage, then bankruptcy restructuring or a fire sale acquisition by a larger rival. On the other side of that same coin, look at how the largest players in the industry have responded to thin margins, not by trying to escape them, but by leaning into scale as the only real defense. Massive national and international chains have spent years pursuing consolidation, merging with or acquiring competitors, specifically to gain the purchasing leverage, distribution efficiency, and private label capacity that smaller operators simply can't achieve. It's a direct acknowledgement of everything we've covered. In a 2% margin business, scale isn't a growth strategy, it's survival infrastructure. And then there's the discount format disruption. Chains built around deliberately minimal SKU counts, heavy private label assortments, and lean staffing models have demonstrated that a fundamentally different cost structure can produce meaningfully stronger margins than the traditional full-service supermarket format, carrying tens of thousands of products across a dozen departments. That's forced legacy chains into an uncomfortable choice: either match the efficiency of the discounters or compete on service and selection while accepting even thinner margins to defend market share. Here's what makes this business genuinely strange to operate. The exact same chain, running the exact same stores with the exact same staff, can look completely different depending on conditions almost entirely outside its control. In a good year, stable fuel prices, low food inflation, healthy consumer spending, no major supply chain disruptions, a well-run chain can hit that coveted 3% plus net margin, the kind of number an industry analyst would call exceptional. Margins above 3% are typically associated with chains carrying strong private label programs, low shrinkage, and efficient labor models operating at full efficiency all at once. In a bad year, a spike in wholesale food costs, a regional minimum wage increase, a bad winter that disrupts trucking routes, a competitor opening 2 blocks away, that same chain can watch its margin compress towards zero or even flip negative without a single major mistake being made. No scandal, no fraud, no obvious failure. Just the accumulated weight of a dozen small cost increases landing in the same 12 months against a margin that never had room to absorb them. This is the part almost nobody understands about owning a supermarket chain. Profitability here isn't primarily a reflection of how well you're running the business. It's a reflection of how much macroeconomic and supply chain turbulence you happen to be exposed to that year. The operator's skill determines whether you survive the bad years. It rarely determines whether the good years happen at all. Step back, and the supermarket chain teaches something bigger than groceries. It's a masterclass in how modern capitalism handles businesses that are essential but structurally low margin. You don't fight the thin margins directly. You build systems around them: private label manufacturing, real estate leverage, supplier data, loyalty programs, promotional revenue, until the food business becomes almost incidental to a much larger machine designed to extract value from every possible angle except the one customers actually see. It's also a lesson in how scale becomes armor. In most industries, being big is an advantage. In this one, being big is closer to a requirement for survival because only scale generates the purchasing power, private label capacity, and cost absorption needed to survive a bad year without breaking. That's precisely why the grocery industry has consolidated so aggressively over the decades, not out of greed alone, but because the alternative to getting bigger is often getting acquired or disappearing entirely. And maybe the sharpest lesson is this: some of the most essential businesses in the world, the ones we depend on every single day, the ones that would cause genuine social disruption if they vanished, are also some of the most financially fragile. Supermarkets don't survive because they're highly profitable. They survive because they're run with an operational precision most industries never have to develop, applied against a margin so thin it leaves almost no room for anything else. So the next time you push a cart down a supermarket aisle, past the bakery smell placed there on purpose, past the end cap display someone paid thousands of dollars to control, past the store brand cereal quietly earning twice the margin of the box next to it, understand what you're actually walking through. It's not just a grocery store. It's one of the most tightly engineered, thinnest margin, highest stakes businesses in modern commerce, dressed up as the most ordinary errand of your week. And the people who built it into an empire didn't do it by selling you food. They did it by mastering everything happening around the food while making sure you never had a reason to notice.